"Please, Your Honor, she's all I have." The gavel came down like a gunshot. Patrice stood there, hands trembling, gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Behind her, a small voice. "Mommy," and just like that, a mother lost her daughter in a courtroom. But there was a man sitting in the very last row. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't family. He was the one person in that room who had the power to end that judge's entire career. And what he did next, you won't see coming. Join me as we dive into this powerful story. But before we do, my neighbor laughed in my face and said I'd never hit 5,000 subscribers. Let's prove him wrong together. Hit subscribe, like, and share. Now let's get into it. Now let me tell you about the man in the last row. Calvin Brooks sat perfectly still, back straight, hands folded over a small leather notebook resting on his knee. He wore a faded navy polo shirt, khaki pants, and plain brown shoes that had seen better days. No watch, no rings. Nothing that would make anyone look twice. To the bailiff, he was just another citizen watching a public hearing. To the court clerk, he was nobody. To Judge Harold Prescott, sitting up on that bench, Calvin Brooks didn't even exist. But Calvin Brooks was far from nobody. 3 blocks away, parked on a quiet side street behind a row of oak trees, a black Bentley sat with the engine running. His driver, a man named Gerald who'd been with him for 11 years, was reading the newspaper and waiting. He'd wait as long as it took. He always did. Because Calvin Brooks was the founder and sole owner of Brooks Capital Group, a real estate development empire worth over $4 billion. His company had built shopping centers, apartment complexes, and office towers across 6 states. His name was on the donor walls of 3 universities. His signature had closed deals that reshaped entire city blocks. But that's not why he was sitting in courtroom C of the Fulton County Courthouse on a Tuesday morning in September. Calvin was also the chairman of the Georgia State Commission on Judicial Conduct. Now, most people have never heard of that commission, and that's part of the problem. It's the body responsible for investigating complaints against judges, misconduct, bias, abuse of power. When a judge crosses the line, this commission is supposed to step in. They can investigate, they can discipline, and in serious cases, they can recommend that a judge be removed from the bench entirely. Calvin had served on the commission for 6 years, but for the last 4, he'd been doing something most chairmen never did. He went to courtrooms himself, not announced, not in a suit, not with an entourage. He dressed down, he sat in the back, and he watched. 2 to 3 times a month he'd show up at different courthouses across Georgia, family courts, small claims, eviction hearings, the kinds of courtrooms that never made the news. The kinds of courtrooms where people's lives were decided in 45 minutes by a judge who sometimes barely looked up from the paperwork. Calvin believed something simple. Justice only worked when someone was watching, and in family court almost nobody was watching. No cameras, no jury, no media, just a judge, 2 sides, and a decision that could tear a family apart. It was the most powerful courtroom in the country, and it had the least oversight. He'd written about it in his annual reports. He'd spoken about it at legal conferences, but talk didn't change anything, so he started showing up. Today he was here for a specific reason. 3 anonymous complaints had landed on his desk over the past 5 months, all about the same judge, Judge Harold Prescott, Family Court Division, Fulton County. The complaints told a similar story. Prescott favored the side with the expensive lawyer. He rushed cases where one party couldn't afford representation. He interrupted. He dismissed evidence without proper review. One complaint said it plainly. He treats poor people like they're wasting his time. Calvin had read each complaint carefully, highlighted sections, made notes, but complaints were just words on paper. He needed to see it for himself. So here he was, notebook open, pen ready, watching Judge Prescott adjust his glasses and shuffle through a stack of files like he was sorting mail. Calvin didn't know that what he was about to witness in the next 45 minutes wouldn't just confirm every complaint on his desk. It would change the life of a woman he'd never met, and quietly, in ways he couldn't yet imagine, it would change his own. The courtroom door opened. A woman walked in. She was young, early 30s maybe, She had her hair pulled back tight the way women do when they want to look put together but don't have time to fuss. She wore a black blazer that was slightly too big in the shoulders, borrowed maybe, or bought secondhand for this exact day. In her right hand, she carried a clear plastic bag, the kind you'd get at a dollar store. Inside it, a stack of papers, some folded, some creased at the corners, held together with a rubber band. In her left hand, a half-empty bottle of water. No briefcase, no laptop, no lawyer. Calvin watched her walk to the table on the left side of the courtroom. She set down her plastic bag carefully, like it contained something precious. Then she pulled out a chair and sat. Her hands were shaking. She folded them in her lap to hide it. On the other side of the courtroom, the contrast hit Calvin like cold water. A man sat at the opposite table, tall, well-built, wearing a charcoal gray suit that fit like it had been tailored yesterday. His shoes were polished so clean they caught the fluorescent light. Next to him sat an older gentleman, silver hair swept back neatly, gray suit, red tie. The kind of composure that came from 30 years of winning in rooms just like this one. Calvin recognized him immediately. Richard Whitfield, senior partner at Whitfield & Associates, one of the most expensive family law firms in Atlanta. His hourly rate alone was more than most people made in a week. On Whitfield's table sat a laptop, a leather binder thick with tabbed documents, printed charts, and a neat row of color-coded folders. Everything organized, everything polished, everything designed to say one thing. We came prepared. We came to win. Calvin's eyes moved back to the woman, back to her plastic bag and her crumpled papers and her borrowed blazer. He didn't need to read the case file to understand what he was looking at. This was a custody case, and it wasn't even close to a fair fight. The man in the suit didn't look at her. Not once. He leaned over to whisper something to Whitfield, and Whitfield nodded with a small, confident smile. Calvin picked up his pen. Then he set it down again. He didn't need to write anything yet. He needed to watch what Judge Prescott would do next. Now, to understand why this moment mattered so much, why everything that was about to happen in that courtroom would cut so deep, you need to know who this woman was, where she came from, and what she'd already been through just to be standing in that room. Her name was Patrice Simmons. She was 31 years old, and her life had never once been easy. Patrice grew up on the south side of Atlanta. Small house, chain-link fence, two-bedroom place she shared with her mama, her younger brother Corey, and a rotating cast of cousins who needed somewhere to stay. Her father, James Simmons, was an electrician, good man, worked hard, never missed a day unless he was sick, and even then he usually went anyway. James died when Patrice was 14, a job site accident, faulty wiring in a building that should have been condemned 2 years earlier. The company paid out a small settlement, barely enough to cover the funeral and 3 months of rent. After that, Patrice's mother, Gloria, picked up a second job, night shifts at a hospital laundry facility. She'd come home at 6 in the morning, sleep till noon, then head to her day shift, cleaning offices downtown. Patrice watched her mother disappear into work the way some people disappear into grief. Quietly, completely, without complaint, and she made herself a promise. She would never be a burden. She would carry her own weight. She graduated high school, not at the top of her class, but close enough. She wanted to go to nursing school, but there was no money for that, so she got her CNA certification instead, certified nursing assistant. It took 8 weeks of training and got her a job at a senior living facility called Sunrise Gardens on the east side of the city. The pay was $16.50 an hour. Not much, but it was steady, and Patrice loved the work. She loved the residents. She loved being the person who showed up when someone needed help getting out of bed, or eating lunch, or just having somebody to talk to. She was 23 when she met Darnell Simmons. He was 25, selling cars at a dealership off Moreland Avenue. Charming, funny, the kind of man who could make you feel like the only person in the room. They got married after a year of dating. Small ceremony. Gloria cried the whole time. Good tears. A year later, Keela was born. 6 pounds, 4 ounces. Dark brown eyes, just like her mother. And the moment Patrice held her daughter for the first time, something inside her shifted. She'd loved before. Her mama. Her brother. But this was different. This was the kind of love that rewired everything. Every decision she made from that point on had Keela at the center of it. For 2 years, things were good. Not perfect, but good. They had a small apartment. Darnell was working his way up at the dealership. Patrice kept her shifts at Sunrise Gardens. Then Darnell got promoted. Then promoted again. Then he opened his own dealership with a loan from a buddy. Suddenly there was more money. A bigger apartment. New clothes. A leased car that smelled like leather. But the more Darnell got, the less he seemed to see Patrice. He started coming home late, making excuses, picking fights about nothing. He told her once after a dinner party where she'd felt out of place among his new friends that she needed to grow, that she was still the same girl from the South Side, that he'd moved up and she hadn't. In the United States, here's something most people don't realize. In family court, you are not guaranteed a lawyer. Not like in criminal court, where the state will appoint one for you. In family court, if you can't afford an attorney, you're on your own. And roughly 70 to 80% of custody cases in this country have at least one side representing themselves. Not because they want to, because they have no other choice. Patrice was one of those people. She'd had a lawyer once, paid for it by selling her car, a 2004 Honda Civic with 160,000 miles on it. She'd gotten $3,200 for it. The lawyer took $2,500 as a retainer, did some paperwork, filed some motions. Then the money ran out and so did the lawyer. Dropped the case with a polite email and a referral to legal aid that had a 6-month waiting list. So Patrice stood in that courtroom alone, with her plastic bag of documents and her borrowed blazer and her half-empty water bottle, facing a man who had a lawyer that charged $800 an hour. Patrice didn't know it yet, but the system she was about to face was never designed for people like her. Richard Whitfield stood up like he'd done this 1,000 times, and he had. He buttoned his jacket with one hand, adjusted his glasses with the other, and addressed the court with the kind of calm that only comes from knowing you've already won. Your Honor, my client, Mr. Darnell Simmons, is a successful business owner. He operates a thriving automobile dealership here in Atlanta. His annual income exceeds $240,000. He owns a 4-bedroom home in a safe, well-rated school district. He has the financial stability, the living space, and the resources to provide his daughter with the best possible upbringing. Prescott was nodding, not subtly, nodding like a man listening to music he enjoyed. Whitfield continued, "We have submitted financial records, tax returns, a home inspection report, and character references from 6 individuals, including a pastor, a school board member, and a licensed family therapist who has evaluated Mr. Simmons and found him to be a capable and loving father." He paused. Let the words land. "We respectfully ask the court to grant primary custody to Mr. Simmons with supervised visitation for the respondent." Supervised visitation. Calvin underlined those 2 words in his notebook. That was aggressive. That meant Whitfield wasn't just trying to win custody. He was trying to paint Patrice as unfit. That required evidence. Or at least the appearance of it. Your Honor, Whitfield added, "We believe the child's best interest is served by a stable environment. And with all due respect to Miss Simmons, stability requires resources." Prescott leaned back in his chair. "Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. Very thorough." He turned to Patrice. "Miss Simmons, your response." Patrice stood. Her chair scraped against the floor. The sound echoed in the half-empty courtroom like a scratch on glass. She cleared her throat. "Your Honor, I have been Keela's primary caregiver since the day she was born. I am the one who takes her to school every morning. I am the one who sits with her when she's sick. I am the one who helps her with her homework every night. I know my income is not as high as her father's, but I provide a loving, safe home for my daughter, and I always have." Her voice was shaking, but she kept going. "I brought a letter from Keela's first-grade teacher, Mrs. Dawson, who can confirm that I attend every parent-teacher conference, every school event, every field trip. I also brought a letter from our pediatrician showing that Keela is healthy up to date on all vaccinations and that I have never missed an appointment. She reached into her plastic bag and pulled out 2 pieces of paper, walked them up toward the bench. Prescott held up his hand. Are these notarized, Miss Simmons? Patrice stopped. I'm sorry, these letters. Are they notarized? Do they carry official certification? No, Your Honor. They're just letters from her teacher and her doctor. Prescott shook his head slowly. I can't accept unverified documents as evidence, Miss Simmons. You need to understand that this is a court of law. There are procedures. Calvin's pen stopped moving. He looked at the stack of documents on Whitfield's table. The character references Whitfield had submitted, 6 of them. Calvin was willing to bet his entire fortune that at least half of those were simple letters too. Not notarized, not certified, just typed on letterhead and signed. And Prescott hadn't questioned a single one. Patrice looked lost. But, Your Honor, these are from professionals who know my daughter. They can speak to the kind of mother I am. Miss Simmons, I need facts. I need documentation. I don't need emotional appeals. Let's move on. Do you have anything else? The way he said emotional appeals. Like her love for her child was an inconvenience. Like a mother fighting for her daughter was wasting his time. Patrice tried again. She talked about Keela's bedtime routine, about how Keela still slept with a stuffed rabbit that Patrice had bought her when she was 2, about how Keela cried every time she had to go to her father's house because she wanted to stay with Mommy. Prescott cut her off. Miss Simmons, I'm going to ask you to stick to the relevant facts. The court's time is limited. Calvin looked at the clock on the wall. Whitfield had spoken for 14 minutes. Patrice had been given less than 6, and she'd been interrupted 3 times. That's when Calvin saw it. The pattern. Clear as daylight. Prescott wasn't just biased. He was using procedure like a weapon. Every rule he enforced on Patrice, he'd waived for Whitfield. Every standard he demanded from her, he'd ignored from the other side. It wasn't random. It was systematic. And it was invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. Patrice's voice broke. Your Honor, I am a good mother. My daughter needs me. Please. Prescott glanced at his watch. Then he looked back at his papers. Calvin sat perfectly still, but inside him a storm was building. Prescott shuffled his papers for a moment. Then he looked up. Having reviewed the evidence presented by both parties and considering the financial stability, living arrangements, and overall capacity of each parent to provide for the minor child, this court finds it in the best interest of the child, Keela Simmons, to grant primary physical and legal custody to the petitioner, Darnell Simmons. He said it like he was reading a grocery receipt. No pause, no wait, just words in a row. The respondent, Patrice Simmons, shall be granted supervised visitation twice per month at a court-approved facility pending a formal evaluation. Supervised visitation, twice a month, at a facility. Like she was dangerous. Like she was someone her own daughter needed to be protected from. The gavel came down. One sharp crack that split the air in half. Patrice didn't move. She stood behind her table with her hands flat on the surface like the wood was the only thing keeping her upright. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The papers she'd been holding slipped from her fingers and drifted to the floor like leaves off a dead tree. Across the aisle, Darnell leaned toward Whitfield. They shook hands. A small, quiet handshake. The kind men give each other when a deal closes. Darnell didn't smile exactly, but there was something in his face. Relief, maybe. Or satisfaction. He still didn't look at Patrice. The court clerk called for the next case. Just like that. Like a family hadn't just been torn apart in this room 30 seconds ago. Patrice gathered her papers from the floor. Her hands were trembling so badly that she dropped them twice before she got them all. She put them back in the plastic bag. She picked up her half-empty water bottle. She walked out of the courtroom like a woman walking through a dream she couldn't wake up from. In the hallway, Keela was sitting on a wooden bench, swinging her legs. A court aide sat next to her, scrolling through a phone. When Keela saw her mother, she jumped down and ran. Mommy, can we go home now? Patrice dropped to her knees on the cold tile floor. She wrapped her arms around her daughter and held on like the world was trying to pull Keela away. Because it was, she couldn't answer. She just held her. face pressed against Keela's hair, eyes closed, breathing in the smell of her child's shampoo. Strawberry. The cheap kind from the dollar store that Keela loved because it was pink. "Mommy, are you okay?" "I'm okay, baby," Patrice whispered. But her voice cracked on the last word, and the tears finally came. Not the crying from the courtroom. This was deeper. This was the sound of something inside her breaking apart. Calvin stood in the doorway of the courtroom. He'd watched the whole thing. The verdict, the handshake, the papers on the floor. And now this, a mother on her knees holding her daughter in a courthouse hallway, knowing she was about to lose her. He stood there for a long time, longer than he should have, because he wasn't just seeing Patrice anymore. He was seeing someone else, someone from a long time ago. Calvin closed his notebook. He walked past Patrice and Keela without a word, down the hallway, through the metal detectors, out the front doors of the Fulton County Courthouse into the warm September air. But he didn't walk to his car. He stopped on the courthouse steps, pulled out his phone, and made a call. Now, to understand why that phone call mattered so much, why Calvin didn't just file a complaint and go home, you need to know something about him that very few people knew. Something he carried with him every single day like a stone in his chest. Calvin Brooks was 62 years old, self-made. Built Brooks Capital Group from nothing. Not from a small loan. Not from family money. From nothing. He grew up in Decatur, Georgia. Small brick house on a street where every yard had a chain-link fence and every porch had a plastic chair. His mother, Loretta, was an elementary school teacher. 4th grade, 31 years, at the same school. She made just enough to keep the lights on and food in the kitchen. His father left when Calvin was 7. No note, no explanation. Just gone one morning like smoke through a window screen. Loretta raised Calvin and his older sister Denise on her own. She worked summer school for extra money. She tutored neighborhood kids on weekends. She never complained. Not once. Calvin used to watch her grade papers at the kitchen table at midnight, and he'd think, one day I'm going to make enough money so she never has to work this hard again. He did. But that's not the part of this story that matters. The part that matters is what happened to Denise. Denise was 4 years older than Calvin. Smart. Funny. The kind of woman who could make a room feel warmer just by walking in. She married a man named Vernon when she was 23. Vernon seemed fine at first. Polite, church-going, had a job at a warehouse. They had a daughter, Shayla, born on a rainy Tuesday in March. Denise loved that child more than air. But Vernon changed, the way some people do when they think they own something. He started controlling the money, started questioning where Denise went, started raising his voice, then his hands. Denise filed for divorce when Shayla was 5. She had no money saved. Vernon had drained their joint account. She couldn't afford a lawyer. She went to legal aid, but the waiting list was 4 months long. Vernon hired an attorney. A decent one. Not expensive, but experienced. And when the custody hearing came, the judge looked at Vernon's stable job, his clean record, his lawyer's polished arguments, and Denise standing there alone, with a folder full of crumpled papers, trying to explain why she should keep her own child. The judge awarded primary custody to Vernon. Denise fell apart. Slowly at first, then all at once. She stopped eating, stopped leaving the house, lost her job. Calvin tried to help, but he was 22 years old, working as a junior agent at a real estate office, making barely enough to cover his own rent. He didn't have the money to hire a lawyer. He didn't have the connections to fight the system. He didn't have the power to do anything except watch his sister disappear. 3 years later, Denise died. The official cause was heart failure complicated by severe depression. But Calvin knew the truth. The system killed her. It took her daughter, and without Shayla, Denise had no reason to keep going. And Shayla Vernon remarried. His new wife didn't want another woman's child around. Shayla ended up in foster care by the time she was 9, bounced between 3 homes in 2 years. Calvin tried to get custody, but by then he was just starting his company. Single, working 80-hour weeks. The court said he wasn't suitable. Every year, in the United States, over 400,000 children live in the foster care system. Many of them aren't there because their parents are bad people. They're there because the system decided that poverty was the same thing as neglect. That not having money meant not having love. And once a child enters that system, the odds of them coming out whole are devastatingly small. Calvin lost track of Shayla for years. By the time he found her again, she was 19, living in a group home in Macon. Quiet, guarded. The light that Denise had put in her was still there, buried deep, but it had been covered over by years of being passed around like something no one wanted to keep. Calvin built his fortune after that. He built it fast, and he built it deliberately. Not because he loved money, because he understood something most people never learn. In this country, power is the only thing that protects the people you love. And he'd been powerless once. He swore he never would be again. When he joined the State Commission on Judicial Conduct, his colleagues assumed it was a vanity appointment, a rich man's hobby, something to put on a bio. They were wrong. Calvin joined because every time he sat in a courtroom and watched a mother get crushed by a system that was supposed to protect her, he saw Denise. He couldn't save his sister, but he made a promise, standing over her grave on a cold December morning, that he would spend the rest of his life making sure what happened to her didn't happen to anyone else. Not if he could stop it. And today, standing on the courthouse steps with his phone in his hand, watching a woman named Patrice Simmons fall to her knees in a hallway, he knew exactly what he had to do. Calvin climbed into the back seat of the Bentley. Gerald put down the newspaper and started the engine without a word. He'd worked for Calvin long enough to know when his boss needed silence. Calvin pulled out his phone and dialed. Vivian picked up on the second ring. Her voice was brisk and professional, the way it always was. "Mr. Brooks, good afternoon. Vivian, I need something and I need it fast. Of course. What do you need?" "I need every ruling Judge Harold Prescott has issued in Fulton County Family Court over the last 5 years. Every custody case, every visitation order, especially the ones where one party was self-represented. I want the full docket." There was a brief pause. "That's a significant request. Can I ask what prompted it?" "I just watched him take a child from her mother in 45 minutes. The mother had no lawyer. The father had Whitfield and Associates. The judge didn't give the woman a fair hearing, not even close." Vivian was quiet for a moment. She'd worked with Calvin for 9 years. She knew what that tone meant. "I'll have a preliminary report to you by Friday. I also need a background check. A woman named Patrice Simmons. She was the respondent in today's case. I need to know everything. Employment, residence, character. The full picture. Are we looking for something specific?" "I'm looking for the truth," Calvin said simply. "I need to know if she's the kind of mother I think she is, because if she is, I'm going to help her." Gerald drove north through the city traffic. The streets of downtown Atlanta gave way to the wide tree-lined roads of Buckhead. The houses got bigger. The lawns got greener. The world got quieter. Calvin's home sat at the end of a long private drive lined with magnolia trees. It was large, 6 bedrooms, a library that took up the entire east wing, a garden his late wife Marion had planted 15 years ago that the groundskeeper still maintained exactly the way she designed it. White roses along the stone path, lavender by the back fence. A small bench under a dogwood tree where Marion used to sit and read on Sunday mornings. Marion had been gone 8 years now. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in April. Gone by September. 5 months. That's all the time they'd had between the doctor's words and the end. Calvin had built a life since then, a full life, but a quiet one. The house was too big for one person. He knew that. His son Quentin was 34 now, lived in New York, worked in finance. They talked on the phone every couple of weeks. Short calls, surface level. Quentin had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness, and somehow those two things together had created a distance between them that neither knew how to close. That evening, Calvin sat in his study. The room was lined with bookshelves floor to ceiling. A mahogany desk sat in the center, covered with papers and files. A framed photo of Marion stood in the corner. Next to it, a smaller frame. Denise and Shayla, taken at a church picnic when Shayla was 4. Both of them smiling. Calvin opened his notebook from the courthouse. He'd filled 7 pages. He went through them line by line. Then he took a fresh sheet of paper and began writing. Point 1. Judge Prescott allowed petitioner's counsel to present for 14 minutes uninterrupted. Respondent was interrupted 3 times and given less than 6 minutes total. Point 2. Petitioner's character references were accepted without notarization. Respondent's evidence was rejected for lack of notarization. Point 3. No guardian ad litem was appointed for the minor child despite the severity of the custody dispute. Point 4. Judge Prescott did not order a home study or independent evaluation of either party. Point 5. Supervised visitation was ordered for the respondent without any documented evidence of unfitness, neglect, or endangerment. Point 6. The judge displayed visible bias through body language, including nodding during petitioner's presentation and checking his watch during respondent's testimony. Point 7. The overall conduct of the hearing failed to meet the standards set by the Georgia Code of Judicial Conduct Canons 1, 2, and 3. 7 violations in a single 45-minute hearing. Calvin sat back in his chair and stared at the list. Through the proper channels, an investigation into Prescott could take 6 months, maybe longer. These things moved slowly, deliberately slowly, because the system protected its own. But Patrice Simmons didn't have 6 months. The custody order would take effect in 30 days. After that, Keela would be living full-time with Darnell, and Patrice would be visiting her own daughter twice a month in a supervised facility, sitting across a table while a stranger watched them. Calvin knew how that story ended. He'd lived it. He picked up his phone again. "Vivian, one more thing." "Yes, Mr. Brooks. I need you to find me the best family law attorney in Georgia who does pro bono work through legal aid. Someone sharp, someone who fights. And I need them by tomorrow." There was a pause. Then Vivian's voice steady as always. "I'll have a name for you by morning." Calvin hung up. He looked at the photo of Denise and Shayla one more time. Then he turned off his desk lamp and sat in the dark. The administrative process would take months. Patrice didn't have months. She had 30 days. And Calvin Brooks was not going to let those 30 days run out. The report from Vivian landed on Calvin's desk 2 days later. It was 12 pages long, single-spaced, thorough. Calvin poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down to read. Patrice Denise Simmons, age 31, born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, currently employed as a certified nursing assistant at Sunrise Senior Living, a long-term care facility. Hourly wage, $16.50. Average weekly hours, 38 to 42. No overtime available. Calvin paused on that number. $16.50 an hour. That was roughly $34,000 a year before taxes. In Atlanta, where a 1-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood cost at least $1,200 a month, he kept reading. Patrice had been at Sunrise for 7 years. Not a single disciplinary action, not one complaint from a patient or a family member. Her supervisor's evaluation, which Vivian had somehow obtained, described her as one of the most reliable and compassionate caregivers on staff. 3 separate families had written thank you letters to the facility, specifically mentioning Patrice by name. Her apartment was a 1-bedroom unit in East Point, $785 a month. She'd lived there for 3 years. Landlord confirmed she'd never been late on rent, not once. Keela Simmons, age 6, enrolled in 1st grade at Harriet Tubman Elementary. Attendance record near perfect. Only missed 2 days all year, both due to a stomach flu. Her teacher, a Mrs. Dawson, had written in a progress report that Keela was a bright, well-adjusted child with excellent social skills. And then this line, which Calvin read twice. "Her mother is one of the most dedicated parents I've worked with in 14 years of teaching." Calvin set the report down. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. This woman was everything the court should have protected. Hardworking, devoted, present, and the system had chewed her up and spit her out in 45 minutes. Now Calvin had to figure out how to help her without tipping off Prescott. If the judge found out that the chairman of the Judicial Conduct Commission was investigating him, he'd cover his tracks. He'd clean up his docket. He'd call in favors. And Patrice's case would get buried under a mountain of procedural delays that could take years to untangle. Calvin needed to move carefully, like a chess player, not a bulldozer. He picked up his phone and called a contact at the Georgia Legal Aid Foundation. Not the public number, a private line. A woman named Dorothy Parsons who ran their family law division. Calvin had been anonymously funding their pro bono custody program for 3 years through a charitable trust. Dorothy knew the money came from someone with deep pockets. She didn't know it was Calvin Brooks. "Dorothy, it's the Magnolia Fund," Calvin said, using the name of his trust. "Oh, good to hear from you. What can I do?" "I have a case I'd like your team to take on. A custody matter in Fulton County. The mother lost primary custody. She was self-represented. I believe there are strong grounds for appeal. Do you have a name, Patrice Simmons?" The ruling was issued last week by Judge Harold Prescott. "Send me the details. I'll assign one of our attorneys." "I'd like to request someone specific," Calvin said. "If possible, I've been told you have an attorney named Monique Harding, former partner track at a large firm, chose legal aid instead. Strong in family court." Dorothy was quiet for a beat. "You've done your homework. I always do. I'll talk to Monique. If the case has merit, she'll take it." "It has merit," Calvin said. "Trust me." After the call, Calvin did something he hadn't planned. Something that went beyond the careful strategy he'd mapped out in his notebook. He drove to Sunrise Senior Living. He told Gerald to park across the street. Then he walked in alone wearing his plain clothes. He signed in at the front desk as a visitor, wrote down a name he'd found in the facility directory. A resident named Dorothy Mae Collins, room 214. He said he was a friend of the family just stopping by. The receptionist waved him through without a second glance. Calvin walked down the hallway slowly. The place was clean but old. Linoleum floors, fluorescent lights. The smell of disinfectant mixed with something warm. Oatmeal maybe? Or soup. He found a sitting area near the nurse's station and took a chair, opened a magazine, and waited. He didn't have to wait long. Patrice came around the corner pushing a wheelchair. In it sat an elderly woman with thin white hair and bright blue eyes. Patrice was talking to her in a low, gentle voice. "Mrs. Collins, your daughter called this morning. She said she's coming to visit on Saturday." "Isn't that wonderful?" The old woman looked up. She seemed confused. "My daughter, yes, ma'am, Sandra. She's coming Saturday afternoon." Mrs. Collins' face softened. "Sandra, she has my mother's eyes." "She does," Patrice said, smiling. "Now let's get you to the sunroom. The light is beautiful this time of day." Calvin watched from behind his magazine. He watched Patrice park the wheelchair by the window and adjust the blanket on Mrs. Collins' lap. He watched her pour a cup of water and hold it steady while the old woman drank. He watched her crouch down so they were eye to eye and talk to her like she was the most important person in the world. Mrs. Collins reached out and took Patrice's hand. "You remind me of my daughter." Patrice laughed softly. "Well, I'm your daughter for today then," the old woman smiled, a real smile. The kind that starts in the eyes. Calvin felt something shift inside his chest. A loosening. Like a knot that had been pulled tight for 30 years was finally starting to come undone. This wasn't just a good mother. This was a good person, down to her bones, the kind of person who gave warmth to everyone she touched, even when she had nothing left to give. Calvin stood up. He walked out of the facility without speaking to anyone. Without Patrice ever knowing he'd been there, he climbed into the back seat of the Bentley. Gerald started the engine, and for the first time in 30 years, Calvin felt something he'd almost forgotten the shape of, something that felt like hope. 3 days later, Patrice was sitting at her kitchen table in her apartment in East Point. The table was small, barely big enough for two. One leg was shorter than the others, so she'd folded a piece of cardboard and wedged it underneath to keep it level. Keela was on the floor behind her, lying on her stomach with a box of crayons, drawing something on a piece of printer paper. She was humming a song she'd learned at school, something about a caterpillar. Patrice wasn't humming. She was staring at a stack of envelopes: electric bill, water bill, the credit card she'd used to pay for Keela's school supplies, a letter from the court confirming the custody order, and the timeline for transfer of physical custody. 23 days. 23 days until Keela would go to live with Darnell full-time. 23 days until Patrice would become a visitor in her own daughter's life. She picked up the court letter and read it again. The words blurred. She'd read it so many times that the sentences had stopped meaning anything. They were just shapes on a page. Shapes that were going to take her child away. Her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. Normally she wouldn't answer. Too many spam calls. But something made her pick up. Hello, hi, is this Patrice Simmons? Yes, who's calling? My name is Monique Harding. I'm an attorney with Georgia Legal Aid Foundation. I'm calling about your custody case. Patrice's hand tightened around the phone. I can't afford a lawyer. I already tried that once. He dropped me when the money ran out. I understand. And I'm sorry that happened to you. But this is different. Our program is fully funded through a private grant. You would not pay a single cent. Not for my time, not for filing fees, not for anything. Patrice was quiet. She'd been burned before. Promises that sounded too good. Help that disappeared when things got hard. Why me? She asked. How did you even get my name? Your case was flagged through our intake system. We review recent family court rulings, and yours raised concerns. I've looked at the docket, Patrice, and I believe there are strong grounds for an appeal. Patrice closed her eyes. She could hear Keela humming behind her. The Caterpillar song. What kind of grounds? Procedural errors, possible judicial bias, failure to appoint a guardian ad litem for your daughter. There are at least 4 issues I can identify just from the initial review, and I'd like to dig deeper. Patrice's throat tightened. She wanted to believe this. She wanted it so badly that it hurt. Miss Harding, the last lawyer I had, took $2,500 from me and then sent me an email saying he couldn't continue. I sold my car to pay him. I don't have anything left to sell. Monique's voice was steady, warm but not soft. The voice of someone who'd heard this story before and had decided a long time ago to do something about it. Patrice, I hear you. And I want you to know something. I left a 6-figure job at a private firm to do this work. I'm not here because someone told me to be. I'm here because I chose to be. I don't drop clients. And I don't lose cases I believe in. Silence. Patrice opened her eyes, looked at Keela on the floor. The drawing was taking shape now. A house with a triangle roof. 2 stick figures standing in front of it. One tall, one small, holding hands. Okay, Patrice said quietly. Okay, I'll do it. They talked for another 15 minutes. Monique explained the process. She'd need to review the full court transcript, the evidence from both sides, and the judge's written findings. She'd file a motion for reconsideration within 2 weeks. If that was denied, they'd go to appellate court. After Patrice hung up, she sat there for a long time. Then the tears came, not the tears from the courthouse. Those had been dark and heavy like stones in her chest. These were different, lighter, warmer, like rain after a long drought. Mommy, are you okay? Kayla looked up from her drawing. I'm okay, baby. Patrice wiped her eyes and smiled. I'm better than okay. That night, after Kayla was asleep, Patrice called her mother. Mommy, someone called me today. A lawyer. She says she can help me fight the ruling, and it won't cost me anything. Gloria was quiet on the other end. Then she said carefully, who's paying for it? Some kind of grant? A private fund? I don't know the details. Mija, be careful. Nothing in this world is free. I know Mommy. But she sounded real. She sounded like she actually cares. Gloria sighed. A long, tired sigh that held years of worry in it. God works in mysterious ways, baby. Maybe this is one of them. Patrice smiled. Maybe. She hung up and looked at Keela's drawing on the refrigerator. The house with the triangle roof. The 2 stick figures holding hands. Patrice didn't know that God wasn't the only one working on her behalf. The following Friday, Vivian walked into Calvin's study carrying a thick manila folder. She set it on his desk without a word and sat down in the leather chair across from him. Calvin opened the folder. Inside was the full report on Judge Harold Prescott's rulings over the last 5 years. The numbers were damning. In that period, Prescott had presided over 93 custody cases. In 72 of them, at least one party was self-represented. And in 78% of those cases, Prescott ruled in favor of the side with private legal counsel. Regardless of the evidence, Calvin read that number again. 78%. That wasn't preference, that was a pattern. But it got worse. Vivian leaned forward. I had our research team cross-reference Prescott's rulings with the law firms involved. One name kept coming up: Whitfield and Associates. Richard Whitfield has appeared before Prescott 26 times in 5 years. He won 24 of those cases. A 92% win rate. The average win rate for family law attorneys in Fulton County is around 55%. Calvin stared at the page. 24 out of 26. That wasn't skill. That was something else. There's more, Vivian said. Prescott and Whitfield are both members of the Dogwood Hills Golf Club. It's a private club in Roswell. Annual membership, $42,000. I pulled the membership records. They've been co-members for 7 years. They've played together at least twice a month for the last 3 years. Their lockers are side by side. Calvin sat back in his chair. Now this wasn't bribery. Not in the legal sense. There was no envelope of cash, no wire transfer, no quid pro quo that a prosecutor could point to in a courtroom. But it was a conflict of interest so obvious that it practically glowed in the dark. Here's what most people don't realize about family court in America. Unlike criminal court, there's no jury, no 12 citizens watching the proceedings and checking the judge's power. It's just one person on the bench making decisions that determine where children sleep at night. And unlike criminal court, family court rarely attracts media attention. No reporters in the gallery, no cameras, no public scrutiny. Which means that a judge in family court has more unchecked power than almost any other figure in the legal system, and less accountability. Calvin had known this for years. It was the reason he'd joined the commission in the first place. But seeing it laid out in black and white, case after case, family after family, the weight of it pressed down on him like a hand on his chest. Vivian continued. I also found 12 cases where Prescott awarded custody to the wealthier parent despite documented concerns from teachers, social workers, or pediatricians about the home environment. In 3 of those cases, the children were later reported to Child Protective Services for neglect or abuse in the custodial home. 3 children, placed in homes the court chose, homes that hurt them. Calvin closed the folder. He looked at the photo of Denise on his desk. Then he picked up his phone. He called Monique Harding. He didn't use his name. He used the name of the trust. Miss Harding, this is the Magnolia Fund. I understand you've taken on the Simmons case. I have, Monique said. And you should know, I've already found significant issues with the ruling. I'm confident we have grounds for a motion to reconsider. Good. I want you to know that whatever resources you need, they're available. If you need an independent child psychologist to evaluate Keela, we'll cover it. If you need expert witnesses, we'll cover that too. Financial records, deposition costs, whatever it takes. There was a pause. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why this case? We have dozens of mothers in the same situation. Calvin looked at the folder on his desk. At the numbers, at the names, at the pattern that had been hiding in plain sight for 5 years. Because this case isn't just about one mother, he said. It's about a judge who's been doing this for a very long time. And this is the one that's going to stop him. Monique was quiet for a moment. Then she said simply, good. Calvin hung up. He opened the folder again and spread the pages across his desk. 93 cases, 72 with a self-represented parent. 78% ruled against them, 3 children hurt, and 1 judge who'd never been questioned. Calvin knew he was playing a long game. The formal investigation through the commission would take months. Depositions, hearings, reviews. The machinery of accountability moved slowly, because the system was designed to protect itself. But Prescott had been playing his own game for far too long. And nobody had ever dared to challenge him. Until now. Monique showed up at Patrice's apartment on a Wednesday evening. She'd called ahead, but Patrice still seemed surprised when she opened the door, like she wasn't used to people showing up when they said they would. "Come in, sorry about the mess." There was no mess. The apartment was small but spotless. A one-bedroom unit with a kitchen that doubled as a dining room and a living room that doubled as Keela's play area. The couch had a fitted sheet over it because the fabric underneath was worn through. The kitchen table had a folded piece of cardboard under one leg. But everything was clean. Everything was in its place. Keela was sitting on the floor near the window coloring. When she saw Monique, she stood up and walked over with the kind of confidence that only 6-year-olds have. "Are you the lady who's helping my mommy?" Monique crouched down. "I am. My name is Monique. I made you something." Keela ran to her pile of drawings and came back with a piece of paper. She held it out with both hands like it was a diploma. Monique took it. It was a crayon drawing, 2 stick figures, one tall with curly hair, one shorter with a briefcase. Between them, written in wobbly letters, were the words, "A lady who helps mommy." Monique stared at that drawing for a long moment. Then she looked up at Patrice, and something passed between them. An understanding. This wasn't about paperwork or legal strategy. This was about a little girl who wanted to go home. "Thank you, Keela. I love it." Monique folded the drawing carefully and put it in her bag. After Keela went back to coloring, the 2 women sat at the kitchen table. Monique opened her laptop and spread out a thin file folder. "Okay, Patrice, here's where we stand. To challenge the ruling, we're going to file what's called a motion for reconsideration. That means we're asking the court to take another look at the decision. But we can't just say it was unfair. We have to prove specific legal errors." "What kind of errors?" "I've already found 4. Monique held up a finger for each one. "First, the judge gave you significantly less time to present your case than the other side. The court transcript shows your ex-husband's attorney spoke for 14 minutes. You got less than 6, and you were interrupted 3 times. That's a due process concern. I didn't know I could count the minutes." "Most people don't. That's the point," Monique continued. "Second, the judge rejected your evidence, the letters from Keela's teacher and doctor, because they weren't notarized. But the other side submitted 6 character references in the same format, and the judge accepted every one of them. That's unequal application of procedural standards." Patrice's eyes widened. "I knew that felt wrong. I just didn't know what to call it. Now you do." Third, the judge failed to consider independent assessments of Keela's well-being. Her school records, her medical history, her teacher's evaluation, all of it was ignored. And fourth, and this is a big one, no guardian ad litem was appointed for Keela. What's that? A guardian ad litem is a person the court appoints to represent the child's interests. Not the mother's, not the father's, the child's. In a contested custody case involving a minor, this young many jurisdictions require one. The fact that Prescott didn't appoint one is a significant procedural failure. Patrice sat back. She stared at the table for a long moment. Then she looked up. "Why didn't anyone tell me this before? At the hearing, I didn't know any of this. I didn't know I could object. I didn't know I could ask for more time. I didn't know about any of these rules." Monique met her eyes. "Because the system isn't designed to help you understand it, Patrice. It's designed to keep moving. And when one side has a lawyer who knows the rules and the other side doesn't, the system doesn't slow down to explain. It just keeps going." Patrice was quiet. Then she said something Monique didn't expect. "Teach me." "What? Teach me the rules. I want to understand what happened to me. Not just so we can win, but so I never walk into a courtroom blind again." Monique smiled. For the first time since she'd taken the case, she smiled. They worked for 3 hours that night. Monique walked Patrice through the basics of family court procedure. What a motion looks like. What a brief contains. How evidence is submitted and challenged. Patrice took notes in a spiral notebook with a pen that kept running out of ink, so she'd shake it and keep writing. After Monique left, Patrice put Keela to bed. She read her a story, kissed her forehead, turned off the light. Then she went back to the kitchen table and kept working. She wrote letters to Keela's teacher requesting a formal statement. She called the pediatrician's office and left a message asking for certified copies of Keela's medical records. She texted 2 neighbors who'd known her since Keela was born and asked if they'd be willing to provide written statements about her parenting. She worked until 1 in the morning. Her eyes burned. Her back ached from the hard kitchen chair. But for the first time in her life, Patrice wasn't just praying for a miracle. She was building one with her own hands. That Saturday, Calvin went to East Point. Not in the Bentley. He'd asked Gerald to drop him off 2 miles away and drove himself in a rented sedan. A plain gray Nissan. The kind of car that disappeared in any parking lot. There was a community fair happening at the rec center off Washington Road. A small one. The kind of event that only locals knew about. A few tents selling plates of food. A DJ playing gospel and old-school R&B from a folding table. Kids running around with popsicles. Someone had set up a bounce house that leaned slightly to the left. Calvin had funded this event. Or rather, his charitable trust had. A $5,000 grant to the East Point Community Development Association. He'd been donating to them for years. He never attended the events. Never put his name on anything. Today was different. Today, he had a reason to be here. He wore jeans, a plain white button-down with the sleeves rolled up, no watch. He bought a plate of barbecue from a woman at the first tent and sat on a bench near the playground eating quietly. He spotted Patrice after about 20 minutes. She was walking across the grass with Keela holding her hand. Keela wore a yellow dress with white flowers on it, and her hair was in 2 puffs with ribbons. She was bouncing with every step, pulling her mother toward the bounce house. Patrice looked tired, but she was smiling. The kind of smile that takes effort when your world is falling apart, but you put it on anyway because your child is watching. Calvin watched them for a while. Then Keela broke free and sprinted toward the bounce house. She was running full speed, head down, arms pumping, and she crashed directly into Calvin's legs, his plate tilted. Lemonade from the cup he'd set on the bench splashed across his shoes. Keela looked up at him with wide eyes. "Oh." Patrice was right behind her. "Oh my God, I am so sorry." "Keela, what did I tell you about running without looking?" Calvin looked down at his wet shoes. Then he looked at Keela and grinned. "You know what? These shoes needed watering anyway. They've been looking a little dry." Keela giggled. "You can't water shoes. They're not plants." "Are you sure?" Calvin wiggled his foot. "I think I see them growing already." Keela laughed harder. Patrice relaxed. "She's got a lot of energy today. I really am sorry about your shoes." "Don't be." Calvin extended his hand. "I'm Cal, just here enjoying the fair." "Patrice. And this tornado is Kayla." They talked. Easy conversation. The kind that happens between strangers at a cookout when neither one has anywhere else to be. Calvin asked about Keela, how old she was, what grade she was in. Patrice talked about her daughter, the way she always did, with her whole face. Eyes bright, voice warm, every sentence full of pride. "She's in 1st grade. She loves reading. She tells everyone she's going to be a veterinarian because she wants to help animals that are scared." Calvin smiled. "That's a good dream." He asked what Patrice did for work. She told him about Sunrise Senior Living, about the residents she cared for, about how much she loved the work even when it was hard. "The elderly deserve dignity," she said simply. "Just because they're old doesn't mean they stop mattering." Calvin felt something pull in his chest. He thought of his mother Loretta, 31 years in the same classroom, dignity in every lesson. They talked for a while longer. Patrice didn't mention the custody case. She didn't bring up the court or Darnell or any of it. But Calvin saw the shadow cross her face when Keela ran back over and tugged her hand. "Mommy, when can I come home for real?" The question hung in the air like a held breath. Patrice's smile didn't break, but something behind her eyes did. "Soon, baby. Mommy's working on it." Keela nodded and ran off again. Patrice watched her go. Calvin spoke quietly. "She's a remarkable kid. Whoever raised her must be a remarkable person." Patrice looked at him. Her eyes were glassy. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." Calvin said goodbye shortly after. He walked back to the rented Nissan. sat in the driver's seat, didn't start the engine. He sat there for a long time, thinking. Not about legal strategy or commission hearings or judicial conduct codes. He was thinking about a little girl in a yellow dress who wanted to go home, and a mother who was breaking apart inside, but still smiled because her daughter needed to see her strong. This wasn't just a case anymore. This wasn't just a corrupt judge or a broken system. This was a family, a small one, fragile, held together by one woman's love and two hands that refused to let go. And Calvin was going to make sure those hands didn't have to hold on alone. 2 weeks before the hearing, Monique called Calvin. "We have a problem." Calvin set down his coffee. "What kind of problem?" "The motion for reconsideration. It goes back to the same judge, Prescott." Calvin was silent. He's going to hear his own case again. That's how it works at this level. Before we can go to appellate court, we have to give the original judge a chance to correct his own ruling. And we both know he's not going to admit he was wrong. Calvin leaned back in his chair. He knew this. He'd known it since the beginning. The system was built this way. A judge's first chance to fix his mistake was also his best chance to bury it. "You file the best motion you've ever written," Calvin said. "Make it airtight. Cite every rule, every precedent, every standard he violated. Make the record so clean that if he denies it, the appeals court will have no choice but to overturn him. And if he still denies it, then I'll make sure he's not sitting on that bench much longer." Monique paused. "Who are you?" "I'm the person making sure this mother gets a fair hearing. That's all you need to know right now." "Fair enough." That evening, Calvin called an emergency session of the State Commission on Judicial Conduct. He presented everything: the 5-year data, the pattern of rulings, the connection between Prescott and Whitfield through the golf club, the 12 cases where custody went to the wealthier parent, despite evidence suggesting the other home was better, the 3 children who ended up in protective services. The room was quiet when he finished. The commission voted unanimously. A formal investigation into Judge Harold Prescott would begin immediately. An official notice would be sent to Prescott's chambers within 48 hours. That night, Patrice sat on the edge of Keela's bed at Darnell's house. It was a video call. The screen was small. The connection kept buffering. But Keela's face filled the frame, and for Patrice, that was enough. "Mommy, are you coming to get me soon?" "I'm working on it, baby. I promise." "Mommy is fighting for you. I'm not going to stop." Keela was quiet for a second. Then she said, "I know, Mommy. You're the bravest person I know." Patrice pressed her hand against the screen. She couldn't feel her daughter's face, but she held it there anyway. After the call, she sat in her apartment alone. The motion was filed, the evidence was gathered. Monique had prepared everything. There was nothing left to do but wait and pray. But somewhere across the city, in a study lined with books and photographs, a man was making sure that prayer wouldn't be the only thing protecting Patrice Simmons tomorrow morning. The morning of the hearing, the air inside courtroom C felt different, heavier, like the room itself knew what was coming. Patrice sat at the same table she'd sat at before, same side, same chair, but this time Monique Harding sat beside her, and the difference was visible from across the room. Monique wore a black suit, tailored. Her files were organized in a leather binder with color-coded tabs. She had a laptop open, the court transcript from the original hearing loaded on screen, key passages highlighted in yellow. She sat with her back straight and her hands folded, calm, ready. Across the aisle, Whitfield looked over. He'd expected to see Patrice alone again. When he saw Monique, his expression shifted. Just for a second, a flicker of something. Surprise, maybe. Or the first tiny crack of doubt. Darnell sat next to his lawyer. He looked at Patrice, then at Monique, then back at Whitfield. He leaned over and whispered something. Whitfield waved him off. Judge Prescott entered. The bailiff called the court to order. Prescott sat down, adjusted his glasses, and opened the file. "This is the matter of Simmons versus Simmons. We're here on a motion for reconsideration filed by the respondent. Counsel, you may proceed." Monique stood. "Thank you, Your Honor." The respondent respectfully requests that this court reconsider its custody ruling based on 4 specific procedural and substantive errors. She didn't rush, she didn't raise her voice, she laid it out piece by piece like a surgeon making precise cuts. First, the original hearing provided the respondent less than 6 minutes of uninterrupted presentation time, compared to 14 minutes for the petitioner's counsel. The Due Process Clause requires that both parties receive a meaningful opportunity to be heard. The record shows Miss Simmons was interrupted 3 times. Mr. Whitfield was not interrupted once. Prescott shifted in his seat. Second, the court rejected the respondent's documentary evidence, specifically letters from the child's teacher and pediatrician, on the grounds that they lacked notarization. However, the petitioner submitted 6 character references in identical format, none notarized, all of which were accepted without objection. Whitfield stood up. "Your Honor, this is a delay tactic. The original ruling was thorough and well considered." Monique didn't flinch. "Your Honor, with respect, the record speaks for itself. I'm citing the court's own transcript." "Continue," Miss Harding Prescott said tightly. Third, the court did not consider independently obtained assessments of the child's well-being, including school performance records and pediatric evaluations, all of which demonstrate that the child is thriving under the promised respondent's care. And fourth, no guardian ad litem was appointed to represent the interests of the minor child despite the contested nature of this proceeding. She paused. Let the silence do the work. "A mother fighting for her child is not a tactic, Your Honor. It is a right." Whitfield opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the courtroom door opened. Every head turned. Calvin Brooks walked in. He wore a charcoal gray suit, white shirt, no tie. He walked slowly, deliberately, the way a man walks when he wants every step to be noticed. He didn't look at Patrice. He didn't look at Monique. He didn't look at Whitfield. He looked directly at Judge Harold Prescott, and he sat down in the front row. Prescott's face changed. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies. It was subtler than that. The color drained from his cheeks like water from a cracked glass. His hands, which had been resting flat on the bench, curled slightly. His jaw tightened. He knew that face. Every judge in Georgia knew that face. Calvin Brooks, chairman of the State Commission on Judicial Conduct. The man who had the authority to investigate discipline and recommend the removal of any judge in the state. And he was sitting 6 feet away, watching. Prescott cleared his throat. "I think this might be a good time for a brief recess." Monique glanced at Calvin. She didn't know who he was, but she knew what fear looked like on a judge's face. And right now Harold Prescott was afraid. Patrice looked at the man in the front row. She didn't recognize him. She'd never seen him before. But she saw the way the judge reacted to his presence, the way the entire room seemed to shift when he walked in, like gravity had changed direction. "Who is that?" she whispered to Monique. "I don't know," Monique whispered back. "But whoever he is, the judge knows him, and the judge is scared." Patrice looked at Calvin one more time. He sat perfectly still, hands on his knees, watching the bench. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what he'd done for her. She didn't know about the investigation, the funding, the report, the phone calls, or the commission vote. But the viewers knew. They'd known since the beginning. And the game was almost over. Prescott came back from the recess, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in 15 minutes. He sat down, shuffled his papers, and cleared his throat twice before speaking. "After careful consideration, this court will take the motion for reconsideration under advisement. A ruling will be issued within 14 days. That was it. No decision, no explanation, just a delay. Monique leaned over to Patrice. "That means he's stalling. He knows he can't deny the motion with Calvin Brooks sitting right there, but he can't grant it either without admitting he was wrong." "What happens now?" Patrice whispered. "We wait. But I don't think we'll be waiting long." She was right. 4 days later, Judge Harold Prescott received a hand-delivered letter from the Georgia State Commission on Judicial Conduct. The letter informed him that a formal investigation had been opened into his conduct on the bench. Effective immediately, he was suspended from all judicial duties pending the outcome of the inquiry. The news moved through the Fulton County Courthouse like a brush fire. Prescott had been on that bench for 11 years. He'd never been questioned, never been challenged. And now he was sitting at home, locked out of his own chambers, while a team of investigators pulled apart 5 years of his rulings. Patrice's case was reassigned to Judge Carolyn Webb, a 22-year veteran of the Georgia bench, known for being thorough, fair, and patient. The kind of judge who read every page of every file and asked questions until she understood the full picture. Judge Webb reviewed the entire record, the original hearing transcript, Monique's motion, the evidence Patrice had gathered, the certified letters from Keela's teacher, her pediatrician, her neighbors, the child psychologist's evaluation that Calvin's trust had paid for, which described Keela as deeply bonded to her mother and showing signs of distress from the separation. She also reviewed Darnell's side, his income, his home, his attorney's arguments. Then she issued her ruling. The phone rang on a Thursday afternoon. Patrice was at the kitchen table helping Keela with a worksheet she'd brought home from school. Keela was writing the letter K over and over in wobbly pencil lines. Patrice picked up. "Hello, Patrice, it's Monique." Something in her voice made Patrice stand up. She walked to the hallway where Keela couldn't hear. "What happened?" Judge Webb issued her ruling this morning. Monique paused. "Keela is coming home, Patrice. Primary custody. You." Silence. A long, full silence. The kind that holds everything in it. Every sleepless night. Every tear in a courthouse hallway. Every time Keela asked when she could come home for real. Then Patrice made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. Something between a gasp and a cry. The sound a person makes when a weight they've been carrying for so long finally lifts and they don't know what to do with all that sudden lightness. "Are you okay?" Monique asked. Patrice was crying now, not the dark, heavy tears from before. These were warm. These were relief, pouring out of every part of her. "Thank you," she managed. "Thank you. Thank you. You did this, Patrice. You fought for it. I just helped you navigate the system." After they hung up, Patrice slid down the wall and sat on the hallway floor. She pressed her hands against her face and cried until there was nothing left. Then she wiped her eyes, stood up, and walked back to the kitchen. Keela looked up from her worksheet. "Mommy, your eyes are red." "I know, baby. Are you sad?" Patrice knelt down and pulled her daughter into her arms. "No, baby, I'm happy. You're coming home. For real this time." Keela pulled back and looked at her mother's face. Searching for the truth. "For real, for real, for real, for real." Keela threw her arms around Patrice's neck and squeezed with everything she had. Patrice closed her eyes and held her daughter and felt the world put itself back together one piece at a time. Across the city, in a study lined with books and old photographs, Calvin sat alone. Vivian had called him with the news an hour earlier. He'd thanked her and hung up. Now he sat in his leather chair, looking out the window at Marion's garden. The white roses were blooming. The lavender was tall. The bench under the dogwood tree was empty the way it always was. He looked at the photograph of Denise on his desk. Denise and Shayla at the church picnic, both of them smiling. "I couldn't save you," he said quietly. "But I saved her." The room was silent. In the weeks that followed, the investigation into Judge Prescott widened. The commission uncovered 15 additional cases with patterns of bias similar to Patrice's. Families who'd been torn apart by rulings that favored wealth over evidence. Children placed in homes that hurt them because a judge had decided money was the same thing as love. Prescott was formally removed from the bench. His law license was suspended pending a separate inquiry by the state bar. Richard Whitfield, his golfing partner and frequent courtroom collaborator, was placed under review by the Georgia Bar Association for potential ethical violations. But this story wasn't over yet. 2 weeks after the ruling, Calvin drove to East Point. This time, he took the Bentley. This time, he wore a suit. He parked on the street outside Patrice's apartment building, walked up the stairs, knocked on the door. Patrice opened it. She saw him and her face lit up for a second before confusion set in. "Cal, what are you doing here? How do you know where I live?" Calvin took a breath. "Patrice, my name isn't Cal. My name is Calvin Brooks, and I need to tell you something. Patrice's smile faded. She stepped back, but didn't close the door. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table with the cardboard under the leg. Keela was in the other room drawing. Calvin could hear her humming. Calvin started from the beginning. He told Patrice about sitting in the back row of courtroom C the day she lost custody. He told her about the notebook. About Vivian. About the investigation into Prescott that he'd been conducting long before he ever saw her face. He told her about the Magnolia Fund, about how he'd arranged for Monique to take her case, about the child psychologist, the expert witnesses, the resources that appeared out of nowhere when she needed them most. And then he told her about Denise. His voice changed when he got to that part. The steadiness broke, just slightly, like a crack in a dam that's held for 30 years. "My sister lost her daughter the same way you almost lost Keela. A judge who didn't care. A system that wasn't built for people like her. She never recovered, Patrice. She died 3 years later. And her daughter, my niece, she ended up in foster care. I was 22 years old. I had nothing. No money. No power. No way to help." He stopped, swallowed hard. "I made a promise over Denise's grave that I would spend the rest of my life making sure what happened to her didn't happen to anyone else. That's why I was in that courtroom. That's why I helped you." Patrice was very still. Her face had moved through so many emotions in the last few minutes that it was hard to read. Shock, confusion, something that looked like anger. "You interfered in my life without asking me." "Yes. You went behind my back. You paid for things. You watched me without telling me who you were." "Yes, I did all of that. Why didn't you just tell me?" "Because if Prescott found out someone was investigating him, he would have buried your case. I had to move carefully. For your sake, and for every other mother he'd done this to." Patrice looked away. She stared at the refrigerator. Keela's drawings were still pinned there. The house with the triangle roof. The 2 stick figures holding hands. The silence stretched. Calvin didn't fill it. He'd said what he came to say. The rest was up to her. Finally, Patrice spoke. "You manipulated my life." Calvin nodded. "I did. And you'd do it again." In a heartbeat. Another silence. Then Patrice looked at him. Really looked at him. And something shifted behind her eyes. Not forgiveness exactly. Something deeper. Recognition. The recognition that someone had seen her fighting alone in the dark and had chosen without being asked to stand beside her. "You gave me back my daughter," she said. Her voice cracked. "No," Calvin said firmly. "You fought for your daughter. You gathered the evidence. You sat in that courtroom and refused to give up. I didn't give you your daughter back, Patrice. I just leveled the playing field." Patrice's eyes filled. She pressed her hands against her face. And then she cried. Not from anger, not from sadness, from something she couldn't name. The overwhelming weight of being seen. When she looked up again, Keela was standing in the doorway holding a crayon drawing. She looked at Calvin, then at her mother, then back at Calvin. "Are you my mom's friend?" Calvin looked at Patrice. Patrice wiped her eyes. Then she nodded. "Yes, baby, he is." 2 years later, Patrice stood on a stage in a blue cap and gown. The auditorium at Georgia State University was packed, families cheering, names being called one by one. When they called her name, Patrice Denise Simmons, Bachelor of Science in Nursing, a voice rang out from the second row louder than any other. "That's my mommy." Keela was standing on her chair holding a poster board sign she'd made with markers and glitter. The letters were crooked but readable. "That's my mommy." Next to Keela, Gloria was crying. The quiet, steady kind of crying that comes from years of prayers finally being answered. And next to Gloria, in a simple gray suit with no tie, sat Calvin Brooks. He wasn't crying, but his eyes were wet. And he was smiling. Calvin had funded Patrice's nursing degree through the Magnolia Fund. Full scholarship, books, supplies, a stipend so she could reduce her hours at Sunrise and focus on school. Patrice had argued about it at first. She didn't want charity. "This isn't charity," Calvin had told her. "This is an investment in you." After graduation, Patrice took a position at Grady Memorial Hospital. Better pay, better hours. A career she'd dreamed about since she was 16 years old, watching her mother come home from night shifts at the hospital laundry. But that wasn't the part Patrice was most proud of. On the first Saturday of every month, Patrice drove to the community center in East Point, the same rec center where Keila had spilled lemonade on Calvin's shoes. She walked in, set up a folding table, and ran a workshop she'd created herself. She called it Know Your Rights. It was a free legal education program for single parents facing custody battles. Patrice would sit with them one by one and explain the things nobody had explained to her. What a guardian ad litem was, how to request one, what constituted judicial bias, how to file a motion for reconsideration, where to find legal aid, what questions to ask, what rights they had that nobody told them about. She wasn't a lawyer. She always said that up front. But she knew the system now. She'd been through it. She'd been crushed by it. And she'd survived. Some days, only 2 or 3 people showed up. Some days, the room was full. It didn't matter. Patrice showed up every time. Calvin and Patrice stayed close. Not romantic. Something different. Something rarer. He became the family she chose, and she became the person who reminded him why he'd started this work in the first place. Keila called him Mr. Cal. Then just Cal. And eventually, when she was 8, she started calling him Grandpa Cal. Calvin never corrected her. He just smiled. One evening, sitting on the bench in Marion's garden, Keila asleep on his lap after a long Sunday dinner, Calvin looked at Patrice and said, "You know, I thought I was saving you that day in the courtroom." Patrice smiled. "And I think you might have saved me too." Sometimes justice doesn't arrive on its own. Sometimes it needs someone brave enough to walk into the courtroom and remind the system who it was built to protect. Now I want to be honest with you. This is a fictional story, but the problems it talks about are very real. In the United States, millions of parents walk into family court every year without a lawyer. Not because they don't care about their children, because they can't afford representation. The system was built to serve everyone, but it doesn't always work that way. If you or someone you know is facing a custody battle without legal help, please look into legal aid resources in your state. Organizations like the Legal Aid Foundation exist in nearly every state and provide free legal assistance to people who qualify. The system isn't perfect, but knowing your rights is the first step to protecting your family. I wrote this story because I believe every child deserves to be with the parent who loves them most, not the parent who can afford the best lawyer. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. See you on the next one. Love you.